Coming from a tradition which for almost 2 centuries had labored under the pejorative label of heretics, Latter-day Saints should be especially attuned to the historical formation of such categories and to revolutions in recent scholarship over the meaning and validity of such labels as they are deployed in Christian historiography. I want to situate the Book of Moses in the midst of such developments, since they give us powerful new grounds for seeing the text as both authentically Christian in its themes and pre-Augustinian in its doctrines. Walter Bauer, in his classic study of Orthodoxy and Heresy, made the argument that Orthodoxy is just the heresy that won out. According to this view, we have a number of competing factions in early Christianity, and the winner writes the narrative. More recent scholars have challenged that interpretation. Alistair McGrath, in his recent study on the topic, argues something close to the opposite. Quote, heresy is best seen as a form of Christian belief that ends up subverting, destabilizing, or even destroying the core of Christian faith. This definition strikes me as consummate question-begging and ignores rather than refutes Bauer's position. Such conceptions, which actually dominate the writing of most Christian history, have an implicit providentialist bias, presuppose that wherever Christianity arrived, in general terms, is where God intended. So orthodoxy becomes synonymous with whatever precedes the end result. Anything that is seen retrospectively to challenge that normative strain is adjudged heresy. But the core of Christian faith, to use McGrath's terms, is precisely what is being contested, especially in the formative 4th and 5th centuries of Christian development in particular. Although Paul is generally credited as the author of Christianity, understood as a system of thought, it is actually Augustine who first erects an interconnected set of precepts into a tightly organized system that serves as the foundation of Christian development for the next 1600 years. As B.R. Rees notes, as the 4th century ends, in the Western Church, there does not even exist a coherent body of doctrine, tried, tested, and refined in the furnace of controversy. Disputes over homoousios or homoousios, of similar substance or of the same substance in that century, like the meaning of the Eucharist in the 16th, are quite clearly debates between the advocates of competing interpretations of a sparse New Testament record, not occasions where a core of biblical truth is under assault by theological barbarians. So I want to look at several simultaneous or near simultaneous developments that do not cause Augustine to defend the core of Christian faith, but to create a new core of Christian faith. In 2 instances, by actually abandoning what were arguably core tenets of early Christian thought, premortal life and moral agency. In order to make all his pieces fit together, Augustine only at this juncture elaborates a systematic structure that will become Christian orthodoxy. Again, to quote Rees, what Augustine did was to build original sin and its transmission, infant baptism, grace, and predestination into a coherent theological system while carrying the first and the last of these to extremes hitherto unimaginable. I want to revisit the context out of which this new system emerges for a few reasons. First, because by so doing, the pre-Augustinian theological world is revealed as demonstrably consonant to a remarkable degree with the theological foundations laid out in the Book of Moses. While this does not establish the provenance of that book of Scripture as authentically ancient, the comparison does establish that at that early date of late 1830, Joseph Smith produces a text that is consistent in its reconstruction of Christian theology along the lines of its pre-Augustinian complexion. And second, I want merely to note that the doctrines it expounds are demonstrably consonant with contemporary theological developments and reconsiderations of the Christian past. This project of elucidating the Gospel of Moses comes at a remarkable moment, I think, in modern Christian history, because a growing chorus of scholars are lamenting what I call the Augustinian triumph. In one of several typical formulations, we read, "The twin condemnation of Pelagius and Origen," writes Elizabeth Clark, "ensured the supremacy of a Christian theology whose central concerns were human sinfulness, not human potentiality. Divine determination, not human freedom and responsibility. God's mystery, not his justice. And then she concludes with this comment, Christianity was perhaps the poorer for their suppression. Now, the chain of events leading to the greatest doctrinal reconstruction in Christian history begins in the early 5th century. Again, as B.R. Rees writes, citing Irenaeus by way of illustration, quote, the emphasis with him is not on a fall in the past, but on our growth in the future. The imitatio Christi takes central stage. Abruptly, however, in the early 5th century, Adam, the tree, and the fruit thereof become the obsessive concern of Augustine and the subsequent tradition. The upheavals could be said to begin in Carthage, North Africa, when in 411, Celestius, a figure about whom little is known, is put on trial for heresy. The charge was that he denied the still emerging doctrine of original sin. According to transcripts of the trial, he had written that at their births, infants are in a state of innocence, which Adam was before his transgression. He is asked if he is denying that the guilt of the original transgression is inherited at birth, and he affirms that yes, he is. Significantly, he points out that at this time, many within the Catholic Church argue against it and some defend it, inasmuch as it is open to discussion and not a matter of heresy. In spite of there being no orthodoxy on the subject, Carthage is within the sphere of Augustine's influence, and thus Celestius is summarily anathematized. Further proof that this verdict is a reflection of Augustine's influence and no settled consensus is the fact that 6 years later, in 417, Celestius appeals to Pope Zosimus, affirming in writing that he maintained original sin binds no single infant. Sin is not born with man, and if infants are baptized, the purpose is not to counter any implied transmission of sin from parent to child, and the Pope clears Celestius of the taint of heresy. But at this same moment, Celestius's teacher Pelagius is similarly summoned in 415 to a conventum in Jerusalem, then to a synod in Jerusalem where he is required to answer a series of charges concerning his denial of original sin and his support of free will. It is significant that in both of these courts, he is exonerated. The historical circumstances lend legitimacy to Pelagius's own claim that in Henry Chadwick's words, he is a traditionalist defending the true faith against the innovations of Augustine. Now, it is generally recognized among scholars that just as Origenism was a construct only tangentially related to Origen's original teachings, so did Augustine erect Pelagius into a boogeyman that lent greater credibility to his own effort to depict himself as the defender of orthodoxy against dangerous innovations, when the opposite was closer to the truth. Ali Bonner, for example, argues in a recent study that, quote, Pelagius did not invent anything, while Augustine and his allies installed as orthodoxy a much more novel Augustinian gospel. Further evidence that this is really the case is noted by Rees, when monks, not only in faraway Marseille, but even in Roman Africa, read Augustine on original sin and free will, quote, they were deeply shocked. He was not expounding orthodoxy, he was creating it. Dennis Grow agrees. Many people beside the Pelagians smelled something very new in Augustine's interpretation of St. Paul, but his continuous tracts against the Pelagians carried the day and convinced the church that this was what it had always taught. Augustine makes it his life's mission to extirpate utterly the teachings of Celestius and the larger body of teachings of his mentor Pelagius. The task consumes him and elicits a huge corpus of works dedicated to that objective. And by 418, the battle is largely over. Augustine succeeds in securing the triple condemnation of Pelagius and Celestius by Emperor Honorius, another council in Carthage, and a finally persuaded Pope Zosimus. In what follows, I will briefly review the doctrinal assertions that clearly are made in the Book of Moses that were lost under the direct or indirect influence of Augustine. And in each case, I will identify the restoration scripture that enunciates a key doctrine and then provide a brief explication of its 4th century defender as well as its demise at Augustine's hands. So I would start with sin and baptism. We read in Moses chapter 6, verse 54, the Son of God hath atoned for original guilt, wherein the sins of the parents cannot be answered upon the heads of the children, for they are whole from the foundation of the world. Critics of the Book of Mormon have alleged that doctrines in that scripture are suspiciously relevant to 19th century debates. That may be true. But in the case of the Book of Moses, we find a constellation of doctrines even more germane to the controversies of the late 4th and early 5th centuries. In this regard, original sin and the baptism of infants were the two explosive issues that precipitated the Pelagian controversies of that era. According to Stuart Squires, the baptism of infants became the primary battlefield on which the fight over original sin as well as the meaning of baptism were fought. We saw above how Celestius roiled these waters with his challenge to the Augustinian view of child baptism as a counter to inherited original guilt. Both Celestius and Pelagius accepted infant baptism, but unenthusiastically, for the same reasons that Luther and the Reformers did. Dermot McCulloch notes that both Calvin and Luther could not defend the practice based on Scripture, but were being forced back unhappily towards saying that there were some things in the life of the church that had been proved by long usage. In other words, they were willing to compromise their biblicism rather than be tarred with a radical Anabaptist brush. Similarly, Pelagius and his cohorts found ample reason to reject the rationale for infant baptism, which was new, but stopped short of dismissing the practice because it was too deeply entrenched by now. Of course, in the absence of original sin, Pelagius's rationale for infant baptism disintegrated. His problem was not his unorthodoxy, but his failure to throw the baby out with the baptism water. In other words, if he had been willing to deny original sin and the baptism of infants, his theology would have been fully self-consistent. As it was, his halfway position was incapable of sustaining the assaults of the Augustinian contingent. Doubly unfortunate insofar as the need to rethink baptism almost took him to an early Christian emphasis in harmony with Restoration teachings. The effects of baptism, Pelagius rightly wrote, are that the baptized become adopted sons and daughters of God. He seemed to understand, as Joseph Smith did, that baptism is first and foremost not about the remission of sins. It is a ritual of adoption into the family of Christ. In the primitive church, remember, converts were often baptized in large groups at Easter since the significance of both was birth to a new life. Notice that in Restoration thought, children under 8 are incapable of sin, and yet 8-year-olds are baptized. This practice illustrates the principal significance of the ordinance as an ordinance of adoption, as does the covenantal language of taking a new name upon us. This covenantal language, in the Book of Mormon especially, is explicitly associated with what Noel Reynolds calls baptism's witnessing function. It has been noted that Moses, chapter 6, verse 55, with its reference to children conceived in sin, evokes the shades of original sin. However, the clear assertion that children are whole from the foundation of the world suggests only one possible meaning of that phrase. Children are born into a world, into a hostile environment where sin's fruits, the bitter, are everywhere in evidence. Part 2, agency. In Moses chapter 7, verse 32, we read, "In the day I created them, and in the Garden of Eden gave I man unto his agency." I will provide an alternate reading of that verse in a moment. Scholars have long noted what some call the Restoration's almost obsessive concern for free moral agency. Arminianism was already gaining strength in Joseph Smith's America, but the Book of Moses added a kind of double etiology, origin story, behind this gift of free agency. First, the Latter-day Saint cosmology puts the contest over human agency at the very beginning of the creation story. Even before the earth is formed, the Father's plan is challenged by a project to, quote, destroy the agency of man. A few chapters later, we read that the Lord said unto Enoch, "Behold, these thy brethren, they are the workmanship of mine hands, and I gave unto them their knowledge in the day that I created them, and in the Garden of Eden gave I unto man his agency." Many saints reading this passage wonder how individuals possessed of agency in the pre-existence could be awarded it in the garden. In fact, Joseph revised that verse to read, "In the Garden of Eden, man had agency." In any case, God did prepare the conditions in the garden in terms of oppositions from which man could freely choose, quickening that gift of agency as we experience it in mortal life. As Lehi will elaborate, man could not act for himself, save it should be that he was enticed by the one or the other. Pelagius frames the principle this way in his writings. Posse, to be able in Latin, is the ability to choose either good actions or evil actions. As we are not burdened by original sin, our ability is not hampered in any way. This posse, he writes, is entirely a gift from God. According to his biographer, Pelagius believed and taught that this human will was itself a form of grace, the grace essential to salvation. Elaine Pagels goes so far as to say, Christian converts of the first 3 centuries regarded the proclamation of audaxousia, the moral freedom to rule oneself, as virtually synonymous with the gospel. Yet with Augustine, she writes, the message changed. Augustine had at one time been a fierce defender of free will. Indeed, the early Augustine wrote a work titled De Libero Arbitrio, the freedom of the will. Although some scholars try to harmonize his positions there with his later insistence on predestination, Augustine himself acknowledged that he had made a paradigm shift when he said, I labored in defense of the free choice of the human will, but, he says, the grace of God conquered. And so, in Augustine's later work, he writes that the grace given by God does not simply allow one to believe, it makes one believe. And that logic, as subsequent authorities like Fulgentius wrote, predestination was the only reasonable conclusion to the Christian doctrine of salvation by grace. Third, preexistence. Moses 6:51. God called upon our father Adam by his own voice, saying, I am God. I made the world and men before they were in the flesh. That verse hardly seems the basis for a restoration doctrine of preexistence. However, the evidence suggests that this was a pivotal seed that immediately bore rich fruit. These Enoch texts were not published until 1833, but it is clear that they were circulating earlier and had profound impact, as 2 documents in early restoration history illustrate. In the first, dated March 1832, entitled A Sample of Pure Language, the name of God is given as Amen, or the being which made all things in its parts, and the children of men are said to be the greatest parts of Amen. The phrasing might not itself have suggested a premortal genealogy, but together with a second revelation, the text points quite clearly to a conception of human spirits emanating from God, with a teaching traceable to Enoch. Little is known of the context in which this second revelation, which is dated to February of 1833, was pronounced. An undated broadside of a poetic rendering of the revelation indicates that the original was, quote, sung in tongues by Elder Patton, interpreted by Elder Sidney Rigdon. Recorded in the hand of Frederick G. Williams, this translation of an instance of tongue singing is clearly based on the 1830 prophecy of Enoch. For in this song, Enoch, as in Joseph Smith's version, quote, saw the beginning, the ending of man. He saw the time when Adam, his father, was made, and he saw that he was in eternity before a grain of dust in the balance was weighed. He saw that he emanated and came down from God. The cross-fertilization of this Amen revelation and the Enoch hymn emerged when an anonymous writer, perhaps W.W. Phelps, published in the church newspaper a poetic celebration of preexistence in May of 1833, bearing clear phrasing from both of those 2 sources. He wrote, before the mountains raised their heads, or the small dust of balance weighed, with God Enoch saw his race began, and from him emanated man. And with him did in glory dwell, before there was an earth or hell. Tellingly, Joseph unambiguously affirmed the eternal preexistence of human spirits early the same month, declaring that man was also in the beginning with God. Intelligence or the light of truth was not created or made, neither indeed can be. Yet Phelps published his poetic declaration, borrowing its language not from that revelation of Joseph Smith, but from the hymn of Enoch in the book of Moses, showing the infiltration of the Enoch text into restoration culture in those earliest years. Now, in the early 5th century, sadly, free will is not the only casualty of Augustine's theory of grace. So too is early Christian belief in mortal preexistence. The logic runs this way. The early Augustine felt perfectly safe in arguing that evil deeds will not be punished justly if they were not performed voluntarily. That, of course, was to imply a powerful argument for preexistence, because life seems self-evidently unfair. And if we don't choose the circumstances of our birth, they must be tied to premortal conditions or purposes. And so Origen had argued that only a preexistent life could explain the variations of blessedness and, more commonly, misery associated with mortal life. He may have gotten some of the details wrong, but Origen and the young Augustine alike sensed that something must have transpired before birth to make greater sense out of God's justice. Pre-existence had been espoused by several church fathers because it addressed not only the justice of God, but the mystery of human embodiment and suffering, the sensitivity of the soul to spiritual birth, and the quest for what seemed a dimly remembered happiness that is sensed but not known in or from this world. Origen is the best known proponent of the view, but it was a familiar carryover from Jewish thought, was familiar to the Essenes, was found in the Gospel of Thomas, the Apocalypse of Adam, the exegesis on the soul, and expressed by Clement of Rome, Clement of Alexandria, Evagrius, Didymus the Blind, Synesius of Cyrene, and others. By the late 4th century, a general state of uncertainty regarding the doctrine prevailed. As Augustine describes the options he is himself deliberating among, quote, "There are 4 views about souls. They come into being by propagation. They are created individually for each person who is born. They already exist somewhere and are sent by God into the bodies of those who are born, or they sink into bodies by their own choice." Now, 3 reasons explain why at this point Augustine is still committed to the doctrine of preexistence. Reason 1, he finds that preexistence aptly accounts for our search for happiness. We cannot search for what we have never known, he writes. In his analogy, the woman searching for her coin presupposes that she once had it. Second, the alternatives are highly problematic. Creationism, the view that God creates the soul at birth, is repugnant to Augustine because it implies that God creates a corrupt soul to match a fallen body. Traducianism, or human-generated souls, the other alternative, is little better because it holds that a fallen human is capable through the sexual act of generating an immortal soul. Third, and most compellingly, premortal existence frees God of the charge of capriciousness or injustice. As Augustine explains, if souls come to inhabit bodies by their own choice, it is quite easy to see that the ignorance and difficulty that result from their own wills are in no way to be blamed on their Creator, since he is without fault, even if he himself sends souls to dwell in bodies. So it changes. Only Augustine's felt need to defend God's justice. If we are saved by grace, he argues, then we are predestined. And if we are predestined, in spite of or in indifference to our own actions and choices, then clearly we cannot apply human categories of justice to God. So Augustine abandons that enterprise altogether. It is not for us, he suggests, to use reason to salvage God's honor. Free will is not worth defending if such defense compromises God's ability to choose whom, how, or when he will, and relegates grace to the peripheries of salvational history. God's apparent injustice must be subsumed by human capitulation to the mysterious workings of the divine. So our perplexity in the absence of any theodicy becomes a sign both of our abject humility and of God's radically other sovereignty. Or, as Augustine puts it more briefly, what kind of justice is this? The inscrutable justice proper to God's dealings with human creatures, a justice beyond our understanding and any right of complaint. Once Augustine, the most influential Christian thinker of the 4th century, abandoned preexistence, the church followed suit. Origenism, the set of beliefs centered on preexistence and universal salvation, undergoes its first in a long line of anathemas by councils and emperors shortly thereafter. God's passions, Moses chapter 7, verse 28. And it came to pass that the God of heaven looked upon the residue of the people, and he wept. And Enoch bore record of it. Joseph then revised the text to indicate that Enoch is in this scene weeping with God and is surprised when he sees God joining in his grief. And he beheld, and lo, the heavens wept also and shed forth their tears as the rain upon the mountains. Though heavens stands in here for God in poetic metonymy, it is clearly God who weeps and who personally responds to Enoch's twice expressed amazement, "How is it thou canst weep?" Significantly, Enoch refers to him as the Father. The divine being declares himself to be God, man of holiness, with Christ referred to as the Son of Man throughout the narrative. As Augustine has exempted God from human categories of justice in his Confessions, he deprived God of any semblance of human emotions as well. Who can sanely say that God is touched by any misery, says Augustine in a typical formulation. Anselm will later explicate Augustine's view of God's pity and love in terms distinctly different than their parental counterparts. How art thou at once pitiful and impassible? When thou lookest upon us in our wretchedness, we feel the effect of thy pity. Thou feelest not the effect. And therefore thou art pitiful because thou savest the wretched, but thou art touched by no fellow suffering in that wretchedness. Leading scholars such as Nicholas Walterstorff are unambiguous in their assessment. The Augustinian God turns out to be remarkably like the Stoic sage, devoid of passions, unfamiliar with longing, foreign to suffering, dwelling in steady bliss. Joseph Campbell's summation in this regard is pertinent. Augustine's conversion to Christianity represented his repudiation of the doctrine of the immanence of divine light, and in its place his acceptance of the Christian doctrine of the absolute transcendence of divinity. And lastly, salvation as a cooperative project. Moses 1:39 and 7:59. For behold, this is my work and my glory, to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man. Thou hast made me and given me a right to thy throne. The book of Moses presents human exaltation as a joint project initiated by God, requiring human consent and cooperation, made even more evident in Abraham's account of the Great Council. Pelagius saw salvation in just such terms. Quote, we always stand in need of God's help, but he gives to us the gift of moral agency. Man always is in a state that he may sin or may not sin, so as to know ourselves always to be of a free will, he writes. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of the Augustinian Revolution, and one corrected by the book of Moses, is the loss of understanding of salvation as a cooperative, transformative venture. The implications of what Augustine reconceived received their fullest expression at the hands of Luther and the Reformers. The historian B.B. Warfield wrote, the Reformation, inwardly considered, was just the ultimate triumph of Augustine's doctrine of grace. If I had time here, I would spend a little bit on one of the most pervasive and injurious myths in Latter-day Saint culture, which is that the Reformation was somehow a preparation for the Restoration. That doctrine represents a complete rewriting of the original story and is based on Augustine's misreading of what it means to be saved, or in his terms, justified. This is how the mistake unfolds. The word justification in Latin literally means the making of someone to be righteous. In Luther's understanding, it rather meant the declaring of someone to be righteous. In his version, God imputes the merits of the crucified and risen Christ through grace to a fallen human being who himself remains without any merit, and who without this imputation would remain unrighteous. So no longer are we engaged on a journey planned from before creation, intending the schooling of God's children through the educative experiences of mortality, envisioning our growth into beings like our divine parents. Instead, we are merely human detritus of an Adamic catastrophe. God punished Jesus for the sin that accrues to all humans. Some of us God has deigned to save before our birth for his own glory. Augustine's reformulation of the gospel met with initial resistance because, as the Pelagians pointed out, quote, the absolute priority of the divine initiative in the work of human salvation appeared to undermine the whole foundation of the Christian life as an active and loving cooperation between God and man. That is the foundational gospel precept central to the Restoration. Other developments roughly contemporaneous with the Augustinian controversies compounded the reshaping of Christian theology, the demise of universalism as the default position, the creedal obfuscation of the nature of God, monasticism as a reorientation of a public for a private framework for spirituality, and many others. My purpose, however, was not to rehearse one more version of what saints have labeled the apostasy. My focus, rather, has been to demonstrate the particularity of the Moses text as a compilation of those doctrines specifically impaired and the confrontation between Augustine and those labeled Pelagians in the early 5th century. Latter-day Saints should recognize the truth of the verdict of R.F. Evans, who writes, Pelagius is one of the most maligned figures in Christian history. Thank you.
We now have some time for some remote questions and answers. Thank you, Terryl, for your fantastic presentation. Terryl, if humans have real agency, then what that means is that there's something in the universe that is not subject to God's sovereignty. Did Augustine ever use that argument?
You know, I don't know that he did. If I were a betting man, I would bet that he did, because that certainly comes out so powerfully and explicitly in Calvin, who is simply a reincarnation of Augustine on crack. So, but I can't think exactly where I would locate that in Augustine.
Thank you for telling us that Calvin was the reincarnation of Augustine on crack. I've always believed that. In fact, Luther was an Augustinian, and Calvin was the ultimate admirer of the writings of Augustine. He tells us somewhere that Augustine's words flowed through his veins.
Right, it's absolutely the case. Restoration scholars like Dermot McCulloch, for example, says that the Restoration was essentially the reinvention and amplification of Augustine. I think that's pretty much a truism in Reformation studies.
Now, I have become aware recently that there are a lot of evangelicals, and I'm not talking about world-class scholars, but more seminary teachers and average folks who are pushing against the Augustinian Calvinism that is so strong within the evangelical community. And they push against it because they believe that Augustinian Calvinism is incompatible with the Bible, as well as incompatible with the character of God and Jesus as depicted in the Bible. Do you see this as a movement that has a future within Orthodox Christianity, or that will have a future impact?
This is a great question. I'm really, really glad you asked this for a couple of reasons. One, because this sense has actually taken on a coherent form, right, in the movement called the New Perspective on Paul movement, whereby any number of Reformation scholars are asking the question. In fact, there's even a paper in a collection of essays under that rubric, and the title of the presentation was the Reformation a colossal mistake? Because it's coming to be recognized not only is the nature of the God that Calvin and Augustine depict a slander against any benevolent, gracious God, it's not consistent with a careful textual reading of the book of Romans. And again, it's become a virtual truism among all biblical scholars that Augustine, who didn't know Greek, is relying on a bad reading of Romans to textually found his whole doctrine of original sin. David Bentley Hart says it most irreverently when he says the whole Reformation was predicated on the fact that a demented African demagogue didn't know how to read Greek, which is a little harsher than, but I mean, that's, you know, the point is that, yeah, they got it wrong textually as well as just kind of theologically. But the larger point I want to make is that there's been a huge watershed, and this is part of what I was trying to touch on in my paper, a watershed in the way that theologian and historians of Christianity are coming to reevaluate and reinterpret those 4th and 5th centuries, recognizing that that the so-called heretics, the ones excluded from the canon of Orthodox writers and thinkers, are so much more in harmony with the modern theological sensibility. I mean, if you read, you know, popular, you know, N.T. Wright comes to mind, right? He doesn't sound like Augustine, he sounds like Pelagius. And so do most theologians writing today. So my sense is that all of the elements are virtually in place for a radically reconstituted Christian historical narrative. And that needs to be undertaken at some point. You know, it was not that long ago that Richard Mouw wrote an article which became a little famous, Mormons. Can't remember the title of the article was in First Things, in which he was telling his fellow evangelicals, just be patient with the Mormons. They're coming along, they'll be closer to Orthodoxy in a little while. When in actual fact, the last 50 years have shown that the Christian world, especially evangelicals, are moving closer to Latter-day Saint theology. They're talking about theosis. They've completely abandoned original sin. They've abandoned predestination. So that was a long answer, sorry.
I've also become aware recently that there is a kind of a growing youth movement among evangelicals toward embracing Calvinism. Can you explain to me what the attraction is to Calvinism? I don't see it.
Yeah, I'm not a psychologist. I'll give you two theories. One is a number of really astute social critics have noted in the last few years that this current generation is a generation that isn't even rebelling against authority because they've never known what it's like to live in a culture where authority was valued or privileged. One explanation is that people are just desperate for a kind of standard, a kind of implacable, immovable standard that they can cling to as a fixed point in the universe. And the Calvinist God certainly gives you that. Another explanation for the resurgence of Calvinism is given by Elaine Pagels in her book, Adam, Eve, and the Serpent, which the whole book is devoted to asking the question, how on earth did Augustine's doctrine of original sin triumph? When, as I was pointing out, it flew in the face of all the orthodoxy of the day and what one would think are the better inclinations of the human heart. And her explanation is that we would rather feel guilty than perplexed. And I thought that was a pretty marvelous insight, that if there's a benevolent God, how do you explain the Holocaust? Right? I mean, we struggle to make sense out of pain and misery and suffering if there's a benevolent God. And so we're confronted with this indecipherable universe. But if instead I offer you, well, there's this God, he's kind of psychopathic, he predetermined ahead of time who would be damned and who would be saved for his own glory, and you're not to question it. Okay, well, that's an explanation. I might not be satisfying, but I'm no longer stupefied. So that was her explanation.
A final question. Would you be willing to give us your very short version of what you alluded to about the Protestant Reformation not laying the foundation for the restoration of the gospel?
I can't do that briefly. Let me take a stab at it.
You've got 1 minute.
The Catholic Church is predicated on priesthood authority and sacramentalism. So is the Latter-day Saints. The Protestants utterly repudiate that. The very first change made to the Catholic Book of Common Prayer was to take out all prayers for the dead because the Protestants believed that we are discrete realms. We have no bearing on their salvation. They have none on ours. Our whole temple theology is complete repudiation of all of that. Calvinism, the Westminster Articles, they all affirm depravity. We reject that. They affirm predestination. We reject that. There isn't a single theological innovation of the Reformation that takes us closer to restoration teachings. In every single case, they take us further and more emphatically away.